think it's quite clear that our criminal justice system has been used once again to effectively recreate caste in America. Now, for those who find that kind of claim hard to swallow, I say, just consider the facts. Our prison system has quintupled, not doubled, not tripled, quintupled in 30 years for reasons that have stunningly little to do with crime. Our prison population went from about 300,000 to well over 2 million. We now have the largest prison population in the world, dwarfing the rates of incarceration of even highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. No other country in the world incarcerates such a large percentage of its racial and ethnic minorities. In fact, if we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, a time when many civil rights activists actually thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high and were complaining about it. But if we were just to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system could lose their jobs. That's how enormous and deeply entrenched in our political and economic system this has become in such an incredibly short period of time. But as staggering as those figures are, they actually obscure the impact in poor communities of color. Some sociologists have argued, this term mass incarceration, it's misleading because it implies that this is a phenomenon that's affecting everybody, when in fact mass incarceration is affecting a small segment of the American population. But within that segment, they're coming for nearly everybody. It was reported several years ago that in Washington, D.C., 3 out of 4 young black men and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Rates of incarceration nearly as shocking can be found in other poor communities of color across America. So what accounts for this? Crime rates, that's what we're told, right? Crime. That's what explains the fact that we have these extraordinary numbers of black men behind bars. But it's not true. Crime rates have not driven incarceration rates in the United States. Over the past 30 years, crime rates have gone up and gone down. They've fluctuated. And today, as bad as they are in many places, are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge crime rates and incarceration rates have moved independently of one another in the United States. Imprisonment rates have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. Now, black men do have higher rates of violent crime than whites, which is often pointed to as a justification for high incarceration rates of African Americans. But violent crime rates have not driven the incarceration rates in the United States. It has been primarily nonviolent crime that has driven the incarceration rates in the United States. And studies also show that, people say, well, why are black men so much more violent than white men? William Julius Wilson, one of the nation's leading sociologists, wrote a book called When Work Disappears. And in it, he cited research showing that if you compare black jobless men to white jobless men, the racial difference in violence nearly disappears. Now, that's not an excuse for violence, no. But there's not something wrong with black men that's not wrong with white men and men of other races as well. Men who are jobless, chronically jobless, are far more likely to be violent, and that's true of black men, white men, Latino men, men of every race and ethnicity in the United States. But again, this prison boom has not been driven by violent crime rates. What has it been driven by? Well, it turns out that the activists who posted that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs, the The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement has been the primary engine of mass incarceration in the United States. In fact, drug convictions alone accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system between 1985 and 2000, the period of the most drastic expansion of our prison system. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. Most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. In fact, white professionals are the group most likely to have used illegal drugs in their lifetime. They're the least likely to have ever gone to jail. And studies show that people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. In fact, where significant differences in the survey data can be found, they indicate that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In fact, in Illinois, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African American. Now, most people say, well, that can't be possible. I mean, black kids deal drugs more than white kids. Just our stereotype is of a black kid stay on the street corner with his pants hanging down, dealing dope. And drug dealing happens in the ghetto. It happens everywhere else in America as well. Everywhere else in America as well. A white kid in rural Kansas, he doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his cocaine. No, he gets it from someone, likely of his own race down the road. Drug dealing happens on college campuses and middle-class white communities and suburban communities, just like it happens in the hood. But the drug war has been waged not by accident, almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Now, people will say to me when they see this data, they say, okay, yes, the disparities are enormous, but it makes sense to wage the drug war in those communities. It makes sense for the Get Tough movement to be concentrated in the communities because that's where the violent offenders are. That's where the drug kingpins are. So that's where we should wage this drug war. In fact, most people assume that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine and the related violence. It's not true. The current drug war was declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at a time when drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan that turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And the time he declared the drug war, drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise. Crack hit the streets a couple years later. From the outset of the drug war, it had very little to do with actual crime and nearly everything to do with racial politics. The drug war was part of a Republican Party strategy, often known as the Southern strategy, of using racially coded appeals, political appeals, get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were resentful of, anxious about, threatened by many of the gains of the civil rights movement. Now, it was poor and working class whites who really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites, they could send their kids to private schools and give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites, they were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who were going to be subject to busing orders and forced to compete on equal terms for the first time with a whole group of people they had been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And this situation created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and Republican Party strategists found that by using these get tough appeals, get tough messages on issues of crime and welfare, that they could persuade poor and working class white voters to defect from the Democratic Party in droves and join the Republican Party as part of the effort to flip the South from blue to red. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. They did. A couple years after the drug war was announced, crack hit the streets, first in Los Angeles and later spread to communities of color across the United States. And the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, hiring staff whose job it was to feed stories of inner-city crack babies and crack users, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, to the media in the hopes of turning crack into a media sensation which would bolster public support for a drug war it had already declared and help persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug users and drug babies and the so-called crack whores, and a wave of punitiveness swept the United States as harsh mandatory minimum sentences for minor drug offenses were passed in Congress and state legislatures, nationwide, authorizing, harsh treatment for drug offenders, harsher treatment than murderers sometimes get. Particularly murderers in other countries get shorter sentences than drug offenders do in the United States. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. They became desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters. And so it was Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors ever dreamed possible. The most dramatic increase in black imprisonment occurred during Bill Clinton's presidency. And it was the Clinton administration, in their effort to prove just how tough they could be, that championed the laws banning drug offenders from public housing and passing federal laws denying them even food stamps for the rest of their lives. So within an incredibly short period of time, a space of about 20 years, suddenly our prison population mushroomed and an enormous new undercast of people emerged. Millions of black and brown people who had been swept into the system, labeled felons, and then ushered into a permanent second-class status for life. Now still, I think the biggest myth about this drug war, though, is that it has been focused on rooting out the most violent offenders or drug kingpins. That has never been the primary goal of this war. Federal funding flows to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost dramatically the sheer numbers, the sheer volume of drug arrests. It's a numbers game. Law enforcement agencies don't get rewarded in cash for bringing down the drug kingpin or the most violent offenders. They get rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of drug arrests, the sheer numbers of people that are swept into the system, which is why these stop and frisk operations happen in poor communities of color where kids are stopped and frisked on their way to the school bus, on their way to the corner store, why their cars are stopped and searched, why DWB, driving while black or brown, suddenly became part of the American lexicon, because people were being stopped and searched en masse, not everywhere, but in poor communities of color in a search for drugs. That's why in 2005, 4 out of 5 drug arrests for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 were for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity.